Gary Trent Jr. Bucket getter, disruptor, Toronto Raptor. By the trade deadline, he'll likely only be two of these things. That's not me saying that or wanting that for the record. Frankly, if it were up to me, he'd be staying. But around the league, executives are saying that they don't expect Trent Jr. to be retained by the Raptors, and with him likely to decline his player option, there is a level of urgency to make a decision on what to do with Trent Jr. It's a decision that the Raptors more or less forced themselves to have to deal with sooner rather than later when they signed him for essentially a 2-year deal because, well, player option, young player, he's not going to take that barring an injury. I'm just going to rip off the band-aid and be perfectly blunt, and I realize this might be controversial because this front office has the image of being able to do no wrong. The Raptors get a lot of credit for being a top-tier organization, and to be clear, this front office is easily the best that they have ever had. But the contract that they signed Gary Trent Jr. to was one which seemed like a misfire from day one, specifically because of the length of time that said contract went on for. This really deserves a deep dive of its own because this obviously isn't what you clicked on this video to watch for, but the Raptors front office, ever since they whiffed on signing Giannis, let key free agents walk for nothing in consecutive off-seasons, not to mention missing on what few prospects they've drafted since then aside from Scotty Barnes and Christian Koloko, and even then both of those guys as good as they are right now, it's a TBA on how good they will be. The front office has not done a great job of addressing this team's talent drain since they won the championship, let alone all the holes that said walking has created, i.e. the bench guards rotation, or lack thereof, as well as the center position that has been essentially a giant question mark for 3 seasons, as the original bench mob moved on or moved up into the starting lineup, or in the case of the center position, they haven't signed anybody or drafted anybody who's able to actually start for them. Again, Christian Koloko might be able to solve that, but right now he's still pretty raw. The contract signing of Gary Trent Jr. in 2021 being for a mere 2 years is a prime example of the uncommitting, overly frugal, and short-sighted manner in which this front office has acted for several seasons. Like, that Dragic Young trade that involved giving up our first, it wasn't just about them saving money or being savvy and moving into the second round to get the guy that they really wanted to. It was about them saving in the short term and the long run by not having to pay Christian Koloko or whoever they might have drafted in the first round if they had their pick, as much as they would were he picked in the first round. Not to mention for less years than he otherwise would have if he doesn't work out. If he does improve in that time, then, well, they're going to have to pay him sooner and run the risk of losing team control earlier than they otherwise would. Speaking of long-term troubles, let's use Trent Jr.'s as an example. Gary Trent Jr. is going to be a free agent this offseason, looking at somewhere over $20 million a year before Malachi Flynn's rookie contract is even up. And unlike Malachi Flynn, Gary is an unrestricted free agent in an offseason where A, lots of teams will have money to throw around, and B, the Raptors would be over the luxury tax line, assuming they don't make a cost-saving move and or trade him and Fred at the deadline since both need new deals. And given how this team has struggled of late, I don't see this uncommitted front office paying more for a team that is currently out of the play-in right now, just so they can rival the Wizards in who can spin their tires the most over the next 5 years. Now, yes, the value that Gary has provided the past 2 seasons on his current contract, given his production, his scoring capabilities, is fantastic. But it's important to remember that at the time, re-signing him at the price per year that he ended up being was actually seen as an overpay, namely because of the contract that Norman Powell, the guy that the Raptors traded to get Gary Trent Jr., based largely on the belief that Powell would be too costly to keep given how well he'd been playing that year, signed for relatively the same amount of money per year as Trent did and for a far longer period of time. And that's before we even get into the fact that Powell wanted to stay with the Raptors, but I digress. I feel like the historical revisionism of that initial reaction to that contract underlies how, in hindsight, the front office hasn't received the criticism it frankly deserved for the current roster construction and all the problems that have built up after 3 not great off seasons. Because this roster, full of non-shooters, lacking on guards to facilitate the offense, and completely unable to protect the rim with its many redundant forwards is the result of the actions and inaction of the front office. There has been a center-sized hole in this roster for 3 consecutive off seasons, and while they might have tried to have filled it with like Aaron Baines, it hasn't worked out. But to bring this back to Gary Trent Jr., only having him for 2 years with the third being a player option that he is almost certain to decline barring an injury. Even at the time, it screamed trade chip. It screamed, we'll figure out what to do with this team when we look at the books and who needs to get paid in 2024. Most specific of all, it screamed he isn't a part of the future. And the subsequent lack of mention of Trent Jr. as a part of the core, treating the core four as Fred VanVleet, Pascal Siakam, Scotty Barnes, and OG Anunoby, only added to the perception that he was going to be an extended rental that was going to be shipped out at some point rather than integral to the future of the team, in part because that would involve the front office committing to a direction for their current core. And considering that this team really struggles to shoot the three, that only makes the rental period look worse in hindsight. Like they are going to be a worse team without Gary Trent Jr. That and Nick Nurse's generally blunt critique of one of his players, it might have been a little too direct this time. I know some people will point out that he's made similarly critical remarks to other players as head coach like Chris Boucher, but not every player is going to respond to that type of criticism in the same way. To say nothing of that same coach benching you in favor of a movie star, and it only added to the idea that Trent Jr. isn't highly valued by the front office beyond what players and picks that he'd eventually net them at the deadline. Seriously, why was Hernangomez starting for the Raptors? Like, wow. It really does come across as disrespectful to the guy and his talents, and props to him for being so professional throughout this whole endeavor. To some extent, I can sort of understand the shortness of the contract from a cold, calculated, purely business perspective. It made sense at the time through a financial lens. The pandemic was, and still is, even though we're pretending it isn't, ongoing. Heck, the Raptors didn't even have full capacity for Scotiabank Arena for a good chunk of the last season. So that was a factor in the length of the deal, and sure, they haven't botched it as badly as the Blazers side of the trade, where they ended up trading Norman Powell for the NBA equivalent of a bag of crisps. And who knows, I'm not fond of trading Trent Jr., but maybe I'll be singing a different tune if he gets moved for a Bargnani-esque swindling of a deal. That's part of how Trent Jr. ended up on the Raptors, if you go back to how the Raptors originally got Norman Powell. At the time that the Trent trade went down, people were calling it a steal for him, but given that Trent Jr. was a restricted free agent at the time, and thus the Raptors had team control over him, assuming no team tried to pry him away with an offer sheet, of course, that they ended up giving him a contract where he was seen as being on the pricier side per year, and could walk away for nothing in 2 years, when the front office knew they were going to have to consolidate with an upcoming cap crunch around that time period and thus might need to trade players who have a lot more value when they have more remaining seasons under their latest contract, not to mention being able to extend their players in the offseason, which they sort of shot themselves in the foot. The 2+1 contract they ended up giving him was incredibly short-sighted because it put the front office in a lose-lose scenario in the long term. It was bad asset management and what we could describe as a self-inflicted wound, at least from a managerial perspective. If his contract was even just 3 years guaranteed, but was slightly more costly per year than it currently is, let's say 19 to 20 million a year with no option for those 3 years, or there was a 4th year with a player option, it would be a lot easier to either evaluate the player you have in the long term, see how they fit with your team, build around them, or for another team to try to trade for him, because at least then, the team he's being traded to could try and extend him over the offseason instead of having to worry about him walking away for nothing. The Raptors would still have to worry about an upcoming cap crunch in the 2023 offseason, regardless of whether they keep him or not. Trading him would just mean the other team has to roughly match salary, but having that extra year alone would make it much easier to either consolidate or to take a step back with a greater set of assets at the front office's disposal. Besides, it's not like they've been making the most of what spare cap space they do have. Aaron Baines or Alex Len, anybody? Again, Hernangomez should not be starting for this team, and thankfully, he hasn't since Gary Trent Jr. has returned to the starting lineup. Heck, they waived Justin Champagnie a short while ago to save the NBA equivalent of minimum wage. In the off chance that the Raptors are looking to pay Gary Trent Jr. to retain his services in the long run, the current market for shooting guards under 25 has gotten really pricey as of late. Just look at some of the deals signed last offseason. RJ Barrett going for around $27 million per year for 4 years, Tyler Hero being extended for about $30 million for 4 years, Jordan Poole netting around $32 million per year for, you guessed it, 4 years. By the by, are we noticing a pattern for the number of years that said players all of whom would have been restricted free agents were they not signed in the offseason, just like Gary Trent Jr. was, are being signed for? Just saying. You can argue about whether Trent Jr. is better, worse, or on par with any of these players. That's not the point. Regardless of whether or not he should be looking at a similar payday, the fact of the matter is that the Raptors wouldn't have had to choose between trading him and paying him at this year's deadline if the original contract that they signed him to was pricier per year, but ultimately granted them a lengthier time of period to evaluate Trent Jr. and his position in the team, or for the team to move him to commit to a different direction with 1 or 2 more years left on his deal, as opposed to dealing him out as an expiring that other teams have to worry about him walking to sign with, like, the Lakers. Again, Malachi Flynn's rookie contract will still be on the books the same year that Gary Trent Jr., regardless of where he ends up, is looking for his 3rd contract, despite the fact that Gary Trent Jr. is actually younger than Malachi Flynn. That's not a joke, you can look it up. Malachi Flynn is older than Gary Trent Jr. Like, there were only 2 scenarios for how this contract would have gone down once the details of the contract were fully announced. Either, 1, Trent improves in the next 2 seasons and thus you have to either move him during the time period or pay him more for a longer contract instead of having him locked up for 3 to 4 years when you had team control, or he doesn't improve and then you're stuck with a fairly large contract that is going to last for a year longer than you really want it to. So either way, you're paying them for 3 years. Obviously the former happened, though not to the extent that the front office likely desired. And that's the one interesting wrinkle to the whole situation. The naked intent to trade him. I think that the Raptors going into last season were banking on Gary Trent Jr. to make a larger leap than he has, so he could be more readily used as the main piece in a trade for the league's next disgruntled star, which isn't to say he hasn't improved in meaningful areas over that season or even the current one despite some struggles earlier on. He does like to gamble on steals, but he can be a very disruptive defender when locked in. He's one of the few Raptors that can actually shoot a 3 right now, even if he is a bit streaky, and he's by no means a complete player given, as I've said multiple times at this point, he's younger than Malachi Flynn. He's not what you call a willing passer, he's not a playmaker necessarily, but he's been a lot better this season at distribution and passing the ball. In summation, while another team is definitely taking a risk by trading for Gary Trent Jr., if they aren't treating him as a rental for the playoffs, he has enough upside and brings enough scoring and hustle on defense that he is worth going after and giving up a decent return for. Plus, any team that is trading for him would get his bird rights, so they have a better shot at retaining him than another team trying to poach him in the offseason. Trent Jr. isn't going to give the Raptors a Donovan Mitchell-style package, but you should be able to get something similar to what, say, Karis LeVert got the Pacers back when they traded him last season. That said, unlike that trade, I think the Raptors would need to get back at least one player who could contribute immediately, whether it be off of the bench or starting at a more pivotal position. As for those interested teams, the most recent rumor was that there were 5 interested in the Raptors' semi-starting shooting guard. Those being the Wizards, the Bulls, the Lakers, the Warriors, and the Hawks. There were some rumblings before this that the Suns and the Heat were making calls, but we'll get to those teams later. One thing I do want to make very clear before we get started: while I will list off a fair amount of names of the players for the rumored teams that the Raptors could get back, and while I will try to do my best to keep in mind that, salary matching is a thing, just because I'm naming all these players, that doesn't mean that the Raptors are going to get back all or even most of the players, picks, or whatnot that are mentioned. This is just to give a general rundown of the viability. How much sense does it make for a given team to make as a partner when it comes to getting a Trent trade done? So don't think of this as me saying that Gary Trent Jr. is worth such and such. Even the aforementioned LeVert comparison, I fully admit that it isn't perfect when it comes to comparing him and Trent Jr. as players and their value around the league. But we spent enough time rambling. Let's get into those teams and what one could look at getting back from them. Golden State Warriors. Alright, let's get the big one out of the way. For quite some time, the big rumor about the Warriors was that they might look to Gary Trent Jr. to help out with their current struggles. Golden State is in a repeating kind of mood, but the losses of Gary Payton II and Otto Porter Jr. have put a lot of pressure on their front office to make a move, and unlike the other teams that Trent Jr. has been linked to, the person who came forth with this one mentioned a specific trade, namely James Wiseman, Jonathan Kuminga, Dante DiVincenzo, and a second-round pick way down the line for Gary Trent Jr. That seems like an overpay for Golden State. I get it. Another ring with Steph Curry is more valuable than the team's future post-Curry, but even with that in mind and this front office's love for a good fleece, that is a lot to give up for Gary Trent Jr. For the Raptors, this would definitely be a sort of step back, leap forward deal. The players they're getting back have extremely high potential, but as individual players, even though Wiseman is in a very pivotal position, they're much less able to contribute right now than Gary Trent Jr., even with Kuminga's recent upswing. And there is a slight problem with this package in particular for the Raptors: roster slots. Each team can only have a certain number of players on the roster, and the Raptors only have one free space right now after they waived Justin Champagnie. And this is something you need to keep in mind with the other teams I'll mention when it comes to any potential package for Trent Jr. or even in general if the Raptors do decide to nuke it. The team doesn't have a lot of free space right now to add in a bunch of new players. If the deal involves taking back more than 2 players and we're not sending out like Kem Birch or Juancho Hernan-Gomez, somebody has to be waived in order to make it work. This is a minor reason why I speculate that the Raptors would want some form of draft capital to come with a return for Gary Trent Jr. The draft isn't just a chance to mold the clay of a team. It allows a team like the Raptors, who, despite representing one of the largest, most diverse cities in the entire world, have never been known for attracting free agents, at least in the NBA. The draft allows them to acquire a cheap, team control piece to add some depth to their bench or possibly develop into one of the players who's a future starter for them once a given core has either shifted via trade or gradually ages. For example, the Raptors need more shooting off the bench, so if they had another pick in, say, this year's draft, and that pick ended up somewhere in the 15 to 18 range, they could look at adding one of the many shooting guards or even a forward with scoring chops in this year's draft like G.G. Jackson. Granted, you shouldn't consider a rookie to be your biggest move in the offseason or to fix the many underlying problems with this roster, even if you're lucky enough to get into the top 4 of this lottery, but it helps you to build up your current roster at a relatively low cost and risk to a team. Plus, having those young talents on the roster gives you another asset to make a larger move to push your team into serious contention. But going back to the Warriors side specifically, this really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I don't mean in terms of this won't work under the salary cap. Moving Wiseman and Kuminga, that's really the only option that they have when it comes to taking back a player or two in a deal to upgrade their bench. What I mean is in the sense of, what is the point of adding Trent Jr. to this roster specifically? What role does he fulfill that isn't filled out by another player on here? They already got a lot of guards on their roster. They need someone who can help them out on the wings or at the 5. Gary Trent Jr. has made strides as a defender, yes, but he's not good enough to stick on the opposing team's forward at the 3 or 4 full time. I guess they could try and do a death lineup remix that in some way involves Gary Trent Jr., but that doesn't seem optimal. And we've been dancing around it this entire time, but yeah, they have Jordan Poole. And if we're talking cap problems, the Warriors are in luxury tax hell right now. They might lose Draymond Green in the offseason because of that. Why would they trade for Trent Jr. when he's playing for his next contract? And why would they give up on 2 of their youngest players who are on much cheaper deals? Heck, they just signed Jordan Poole to a pretty pricey extension. I can't imagine that Trent Jr. would be anything more than a rental. Beyond that, I'm not sure if the whippersnappers that the Raptors would be getting back would be in the most ideal landing spot for their own development. This is assuming, of course, the team doesn't just blow things up, of course, though in that case, you'd want to keep Trent Jr. around for a rebuild. He's, again, very young, but I digress. I know it's hip to say that James Wiseman is a bust, but I honestly think it's premature to make that call. I'm not going to pretend like James Wiseman is the next Dwight Howard. He certainly has not lived up to his drafting pedigree of 2nd overall in the 2020 draft, but he's the same age as Scottie Barnes, and like Scottie, he's asked to do too much from a team with high expectations for him, and his role in the current rotation is simply unclear, more so in James Wiseman's case, of course. Part of the reason for his current struggles isn't just injuries, it's circumstantial. The Warriors are in their final years of their current dynasty, and they're aiming for ring number 5 with Steph Curry, Draymond Green, and Klay Thompson, and again, they might lose Draymond Green in the offseason. They don't have a lot of room for error to let Wiseman develop and make the necessary mistakes for him to become a better player. James Wiseman is simply in the worst possible circumstances, on the wrong team who put him in the wrong role, and they're asking him to make up for the losses of 2 talented veterans who are both considered two-way wings. But is being on the Raptors really the right space for him to make the best version of himself? Nick Nurse is a great coach, but He is notoriously tight when it comes to giving players the ability to play through their mistakes if they aren't playing good defense, and while Wiseman is an incredibly athletic center who could fit into the Raptors' switch-heavy system, he is really bad at defense in a very pivotal position. He's not good at staying with his man, he's not a good rim protector or rebounder despite his height, and he isn't great at setting screens on offense, just typical things you'd expect a center to do, he's not superb at doing. He's a terrific athlete, his touch around the rim is really nice, and he's shown signs that he could become a floor spacer, but right now he's at least a year or two away from being a serious contributor to a playoff team, let alone bridge the gap from one Warriors dynasty to another. Again, this is assuming the Raptors aren't going to blow it up and just let their young guys run things for a while. Despite the Raptors' meager record right now, I'd imagine they're still aiming to make it this year, despite being currently out of the play-in, or at the very least punting this season and retooling around Siakam in the offseason. Speaking of the Warriors bench, Kuminga is in a similar boat. Very athletic wing with enormous upside, but oh boy is his floor low, and while he's shown glimpses of how unstoppable he can be when he puts that aforementioned athleticism to use on both ends, those flashes have been very limited, notably more flashy with Steph's recent absence, but flashes nonetheless. As for Dante DiVincenzo, he's in a different boat, a bench player who can give you a couple of decent minutes on defense while knocking down a three, but he's not exactly what you'd call a 3-and-D sort of player. Really, it's their young players you're banking on the potential of to make this deal a steal in the making. And it's that potential for Kuminga and, yes, even James Wiseman, even if they're being asked to do too much right now, that adds yet another layer to this Trent Jr. going to the Warriors doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, cake. No matter how you slice it, the Warriors trading for help now, Gary doesn't really seem like the guy who's going to fix their current struggles. Miles Turner or Jakob Poeltl, sure, but Trent Jr.? I don't see him as the final piece for this team. I will say that if the deal did go down, I'd be pretty intrigued to see what we could do with Wiseman on offense, and Kuminga is one of the players I was most intrigued by in the 2021 draft, but I think this is the second least likely team for Gary Trent Jr. to end up on that's been mentioned. Speaking of Western Conference teams that are a long shot, the number one team, the LA Lakers. No. Next. Okay, but seriously, the Lakers have by far the worst assets to help with the team right now, and I doubt they'd give up 2 firsts for Trent Jr., especially with Anthony Davis out for an extended period. Patrick Beverley has been terrible all season. Thomas Walker is a center, which the Raptors do need, but he's a center in the same way that Nikola Vucevic is a center, which is to say that they are not a rim-protecting center, nor are they particularly good at defense. Like, the best case scenario for a return from the Lakers is Lonnie Walker, who you'd have to resign in the offseason, a first-round pick that won't convey for 5 years, and a walking flagrant foul who can maybe get you some bench depth from a team desperate enough to take on an aging Patrick Beverley. Apparently the Wolves want him back, so maybe? More likely than not, you're gonna have to buy him out. And given how frugal this front office has been, I doubt they want to entertain that possibility. The one interesting scenario to consider is that if that pick is unprotected, the Raptors could package, say, that pick or their own first during that same year and trade it for some depth and perhaps get some use out of that trade exception that they still have lying around from the young Dragic trade. Though, given the frugalness of this front office, I sincerely doubt that's going to be put to use. Now, a pick that far out is likely going to be protected no matter which one they send out, but you might be able to get something like a backup guard or potentially a cheap center. But I don't think any player you can get with that draft capital is going to move the needle for this season, and any potential player you could get in 2027 is likely to be on a similar boat unless that Laker pick ends up being top 3. So yeah, they might try to snatch him away in the offseason, but that's the only way they can snag Gary Trent Jr. because they don't have the assets to go after him at the deadline. And LeBron James and Anthony Davis are not available. Should go without saying, but there you go. The Washington Wizards. This one is weird, and it's weird for 2 reasons. One is that the Raptors almost traded for one of the guys currently on the Wizards roster, Kristaps Porzingis, albeit when he was on the Dallas Mavericks. At that point, the Raptors wanted to trade Dragic and their first for the year, plus salary to bring the Unicorn to Canada, but the Mavericks wanted Trent Jr. thrown into that deal, and that ended up being the deal breaker for them at the time. 2. The Wizards should not be trading for Trent Jr. People talk about how the Bulls, the Lakers, and the Raptors should blow it up, yet No one is ever making that same statement about Washington. Granted, signing Beal to that Supermax meant that they sort of stuck themselves in the dreaded no man's land of the NBA. It's gonna be difficult to trade a guy who's on a Supermax for 5 years and has a trade kicker that makes him even more expensive if he does get moved. And he has a no trade clause so he can deny going to X or Y team. Now, Beal is a great shooting guard, but he's not so fantastic as to guarantee a playoff berth on his own or when he's your first option. As is, the Wizards are too good to tank without shutting him and Porzingis down, and they're not good enough to be a serious top 6 seed with a chance of getting past the second round. Barring injuries, of course, those will just derail a season and potentially a career. I like Gary Trent Jr. a lot, but he's not the difference between being in the play-in and being a true contender unless you just happen to trade him during a streak where he's scorching hot and said streak doesn't just burn up. As an aside, this isn't the only player of ours that the Wizards have been linked to. There's been some rumors of Fred VanVleet to the Wizards, but you'd be looking at a similar sort of deal for both in terms of filling out the salary cap. First things first, no, you're not getting Kyle Kuzma. He's made it pretty clear what kind of city he wants to be in as an NBA player, and Toronto doesn't fit the glamorous, Instagram-esque lifestyle that him and Ben Simmons no doubt DM each other about. Second, there is a minor complication with the Wizards. If you want an extra pick in this draft, you're going to have to find another team to get involved with this trade because the Wizards don't own their pick for this year's draft. They could trade one as early as 2025 if they remove the protections that they placed on their 2023 pick, but they're not going to get you an extra selection in this draft, and I can't imagine that even the Wizards are delusional enough to loosen the protections on their pick in this year's draft class to make a Trent Jr. trade good to go. I mean, it's not like it's free to begin with. It's not like they can just snap their fingers and make the protections go away. They'll have to send the Knicks something to remove it. Now, technically their pick could come back to them if they lost in the play-in or were just out of the play-in entirely, so they could trade it on draft night, but the deadline comes a wee bit sooner than that, and the Raptors can't exactly wait to move Trent on draft night. Mostly because they can't move him on draft night. That said, the Wizards have the next best thing with a couple of young, interesting players. Rui Hachimura, for one. Originally, I wasn't going to mention him because he seemed untouchable, but with him not being extended in the offseason, coupled with the news that the Wizards tried to trade him for Jay Crowder, he seems very much available. Most likely because he's been dealing with a combination of injuries throughout his career, as well as recent struggles with his mental health. When he is playing, Rui Hachimura is a jack-of-all-trades, high-floor sort of young guy. Good rebounder, decent if unspectacular footwork, okay at playmaking for his position, and he's got that lengthy 7'2" wingspan that this management simply fawns over. His offense it's still a work in progress. His shooting form is alright, but he hasn't seen a ton of improvement from season to season. If nothing else, Rui Hachimura fits the bill for this front office's insatiable desire for a lengthy defensive forward who can't shoot. Even if Rui isn't quite what you'd call a lockdown defender right now. Also, he does need to be re-signed to a new deal, however, he is a restricted free agent, so that shouldn't be too difficult. For those looking for a backup guard, there's former Raptor DeLon. Remember when there was a debate amongst fans as to whether they should have kept him over Fred? Even with VanVleet's subpar play this season, I feel it's fair to say that the front office made the right call in that situation. Not to say that he's a bad player, he's become a decent backup point, good at deflecting, generally solid on defense. His best shooting days are behind him, but, good passer, he can give you minutes off the bench. There's a couple of other players of intrigue on the Wizards, mostly due to them having a fairly crowded front court. Deni Avdija, for one, he's a good defender whose shooting is on the streakier side. Corey Kispert, who was something of a sniper in college last year, and his limited use as a rookie suggests that his shooting will translate in the long run, but both of them have seen pretty limited playtime in Washington for them to be the main return in any deal, and since you'll likely have to pair them with Will Barton to make the money work, well, I'll put it like this. What few Wizards fans I do know have touted him as a superb tank commander, so this deal would either be a win-win or a lose-lose, depending on which direction you want the season to go. Perhaps the most interesting player that could be available is Daniel Gafford. He's basically the budget version of Jakob Poeltl. Similar levels of efficiency, similar rim protecting, shot blocking capabilities, although I'd say he has more notable athleticism than the Yak. Similar problems when it comes to scoring at the line. He's a career sub 60% free throw shooter. Similar lack of ability to space the floor. He doesn't make or take threes. And he is a bit undersized for the position, but he can play the 4 or 5 with ease if you want some flexibility with the lineups you're running, and he's the sort of center that the advanced stats simply adore. He's pretty underrated as far as centers go, and likely going under the radar because, well, the big stories coming out of Washington right now are Porzingis having a bounce back year and Kyle Kuzma wanting out. The big difference between Gafford and Podol is that the Washington Wizards aren't going to demand an overpay of 2 firsts for him like the Spurs are for the Yak. And unlike Jakob Podol, there's no need to worry about resigning him in the offseason because he has an extension that kicks in the next year. Now, one does need to factor in the cap implications of said extension, but given his productivity and room for improvement, it's a pretty fair 3-year deal. The only thing that gives one pause is that Daniel has struggled at times to be consistently engaged, which, yeah, if that hasn't been the theme for this Raptors season outside of Siakam, I don't know what is. So, yeah, Wizards are probably the most viable team thus far, assuming they just want a better shot at making the playoffs, so if that'll make them happy, there's definitely a deal to be worked out between the two with all the intriguing players that they could move. The Atlanta Hawks. The Hawks having interest is another oddity of a name to throw out there. Like, they already have Trae Young, they've got DeJounte Murray, they've got Bogdan, the guard rotation is set. I know their outside shooting has suffered a lot this season, in no small part thanks to a career year worse for Trae Young and John Collins, but is Gary Trent Jr. the best fit for that team? Like, are the Hawks going to have him, Trae, and DeJounte close for them in the fourth as George's poor man's death lineup? Not saying that the Hawks are a bad partner per se, they're rather interesting as a 3 or 4 team trade partner. In terms of a 1-to-1, the Raptors might be less inclined to work something out because the Hawks are an Eastern Conference team, that's the short of it. And because they're an Eastern Conference team, they might not want to make a trade with a potential playoff rival. Say what you will about the Hawks' offseason move, at least they're in contention for a playoff spot right now. And to be perfectly blunt, there's only one obvious trade since, no, the Hawks are not giving up Bogdan for Trent. Like I said, they're already having issues scoring from outside the arc. Why would they give up one of their best shooters to get another 3-point specialist? For both teams, it doesn't really move the needle for them one way or the other if you swap them. And Bogdanovich also has a player option, so you're trading for the opportunity to what? Sign an older player to a new deal when that player has no real upside and a serious chance of declining in the next few years? Like, how does it make sense? This is where we need to acknowledge the fact that because Gary Trent Jr. is going to decline his player option, he offers something as a sort of expiring contract that can double as aiding you in getting to the playoffs because, honestly, trading Trent Jr. to the Hawks would likely entail a pseudo salary dump where the Hawks wind up ditching John Collins. I know, it sounds ridiculous. John Collins has been in trade rumors for literal years, but he's the most obvious candidate even if he's not the most desirable from the outset, but you're not getting Okongwu. Clint Capella might stick out given he's a solid defender and a good rebounder. The man is a double-double machine when he plays, but he has had numerous injuries that have taken him off the floor for prolonged periods that makes him a particularly risky target for a straight-up swap, and if there's one thing that this team doesn't need more of, it's players who are injury-prone. That and Capella often gets beaten by larger centers in rebounding the ball anyway, so yeah. Probably looking at John Collins. Maybe AJ Griffin or Jalen Johnson is an option to throw in, depending on the whole perception about his contract salary and whether the Hawks feel they need to give up more given the length and cost of Collins' contract because the rest of the league sees it more as an albatross contract than they do a real deal. No one will say it's as bad as, say, Duncan Robinson's, but there's not exactly a lot of executives jumping to trade for said contract like he's on some steal of a deal like OG Anunoby. In fact, as far as just matching salary, the Raptors would have to send out Kem Birch or Thad Young just to make the money match. That said, with the Raptors' free agency decisions in the upcoming offseason for player extensions / decisions to make regarding keeping or trading Fred, they might be the only team that could see Collins' contract, at least internally, as a benefit rather than a blight, since they'd have that cap space locked up for several years, and it could allow them to build a package around John for a move for a future star, because the player you're getting back for Gary Trent Jr. is not bad at all. John Collins is definitely having an off year on offense, there's no denying that. He's shooting a ghastly 21% from 3 on about 3 threes a night, last I checked anyway, which is a severe downturn from his prior career average of nearly 38%, and his overall touches have gone down, mostly due to DeJounte Murray eating up a few more than ones he'd normally get, but it's not like he's completely regressed. In fact, he's become a much better defender compared to last season, and can play the role of a small ball 5 who, at least in prior seasons, can help stretch the floor with his 3-point shooting. He's not exactly a self-creator from 3, but he's good coming off the catch and shoot, and he's an effective lob threat. So while you're definitely hoping for him to bounce back to form when it comes to his shooting beyond the arc, he'd also stand to shoot more threes. That was another problem in earlier seasons. Collins isn't some horrendous consolation prize. He's an alright player in his own right. And he could potentially benefit from a team that actually wants him and wants to use him on offense, as opposed to the Hawks who have him stuck in a Slack chat room with Miles Turner titled Trade Rumor Central. The Chicago Bulls. Gonna keep this one short because, unlike the other teams on this list, a trade with the Bulls really depends on the direction that they're going in. If they do decide to blow it up, then Zach LaVine is the obvious trade target. He had a bit of a slow start coming off of injury, and while he's not necessarily cheap, LaVine can play well with or without the ball in his hands. He's a fantastic shooter from 3, and while he isn't the best defender, he's pretty solid for his position. Speaking of defense, that's one of the reasons why you can just rule out Nikola Vucevic. Yes, he's a center, yes, he can shoot, but he is not a rim protecting big man. He's a decent rebounder, but he's not blocking shots like Prime Hakeem. But like I said in a previous video, I don't think the Bulls are going to blow it up this year, or at least not until the draft. For now, they're probably looking to buy and consolidate. They do have a first in this year's draft from the Blazers that they can move, and while it might not be the best pick given where the Blazers are and the heavy protections that would prevent it from being a top lottery pick if they did fall off, there is a lot of intriguing talent on this year's draft board to add some cheap depth, even in the middle of the first round. As for players in salary, that's where it gets tricky because there's only one player that matches up 1-to-1, and it's doubtful that either team wants to make that move. Like, Patrick Williams would be the most obvious candidate if he didn't recently pull himself out of a slump, but even if he was available, which I don't think he is after turning his season around, you would have to pair him with Kobe White, or a combination of Andre Drummond, Dalen Terry, Derek Jones Jr. It's not exactly easy to get the money to work. To do what the Raptors wanted the main return to be Kobe White. I talked about Kobe White in a previous video. He's a similarly streaky shooter to Trent, but the value just isn't there even if they do throw in a pick with White. So that leaves you with the wildcard trade. Lonzo Ball, yes, really, is making quite a bit of money while recovering from injury and is likely going to be out for the rest of the season, which is kind of a problem for a team trying to contend like the Bulls are. And the most recent news about him isn't particularly encouraging. The talent he has is undeniable. The first season with the Bulls showed Lonzo at his very best, with terrific playmaking, disruptive defense, and one of the best shots in all of the NBA. The dude was shooting well above 40% from 3 that entire season. But between how much money he's making, how much the Raptors or any team that would take him on is risking and then hoping he recovers, it's really hard to see the Raptors gambling on Ball being the main piece for them in the next season, and I do say the next season because if you do trade Trent for Lonzo Ball and whatever draft compensation he'll come with, you're fully committing to punting this season. There's no way of getting around that. There's no way you're banking on him being in top shape for the playoffs, let alone being in the playoffs as fodder for the Bucks or the Celtics. It's unrealistic and, frankly, it's not fair to Lonzo Ball. Like, a healthy Lonzo would be perfect for this team, but he's not, and who knows how long it'll be before he steps foot on the court again. There is a genuine chance that he never plays another game in the NBA, let alone at the level he was at before said injury. That uncertainty and the age of Chicago's biggest player is the only reason that I could see the Bulls trading him right now. If they feel the need to contend right now, before DeMar DeRozan declines, given he's pretty old, then they're getting something out of the $20 million or so cap space that Lonzo Ball has taken up on their roster to help them right now. But like I said, that is a huge risk for both parties and especially for the Raptors. And no, this isn't like trading for Kawhi Leonard. As good as Lonzo Ball is, as seamless as a fit he would be on this team when healthy, assuming he does come back healthy, he is not a top 5 player, not even close. I don't know, a trade with the Bulls, it's not impossible, but it's hard to make the money work with players that would be considered available. This is another candidate for a team that might need to get a third one involved. The Phoenix Suns. Okay, this one just baffles me. The Suns do need another guard, but they need one who can run the offense while Chris Paul sits, and Trent is many things, but he is not a pass-first sort of guard. He's been giving up the rock more of late, but he's not exactly racking up a career high in assists, you know? The Suns do have all their picks, but with their current core, it's not like you're looking at a choice draft pick in the future. The youngest guys you'll be looking at are between 24 to 26 years of age, with varying years left on their contracts. Both Cam Johnson and Josh Okogie are expiring like Trent Jr., and I don't think that Jay Crowder, who is also expiring and who is the most obvious salary filler to include in such a deal, does anything for this Raptors roster besides make them older. This is another case where there's only one player on the Suns that the Raptors might look at that would actually be available given the Suns' current needs, and even this one is a stretch because they'll still need another Look, we'll just cut to the chase. It's DeAndre Ayton. I know some people are going to take a look at that contract and some of the off-season news that emerged about Ayton, about him not being committed or playing video games or whatnot, and his frequent arguments with his head coach don't paint the best picture of his character, but frankly, I think this is one of those players in the NBA that would benefit the most from a change of scenery. I mean, Chris Paul doesn't exactly have the best track record when it comes to treating his teammates right. There's a long history of former Clippers and Hornets players who've reiterated how much they hate playing with him, and after all the behind-the-scenes toxicity that permeates the Suns' front office, the racism, the sexism, not to mention the racist, sexist, cheap asshole who referred to Ayton not being worth paying using various racial slurs to emphasize how much he didn't want to pay him, not to mention that they prioritized chasing after Kevin Durant rather than keeping him around and try to trade him at last year's deadline, as well as try to trade him to the Nets for Kevin Durant. Is it any surprise that he's not giving it his all with this team? Like, are you going to do your best work when your racist boss doesn't think you're worth a raise, and you have to work with someone that sounds like they're simply exhausting to share a shift with? Yeah, I don't think so. There's definitely concerns to be had with Ayton, especially since this is one of the few trades where the Raptors will probably have to give up some draft picks of their own in order to get Ayton, barring them trading like Chris Boucher for an extra first and rerouting it to Phoenix. Not to mention that Ayton can simply say no since he has a pseudo no trade clause until the offseason, and there's also the fact that, the Phoenix Suns will still need a center, so they're going to have to get a third team involved to potentially get that center to start for them. It's complicated. There is an inherent risk with going after DeAndre as your franchise's center for years to come when you're giving up some form of draft capital to balance out a deal. But the way I see it, this is more of a buy low for a player who, while certainly not living up to their potential thus far, is way better than the player you'd be looking at drafting if, say, the Raptors managed to click and get it together like they did last season for a playoff berth. And say what you will about Ayton, he'd easily be the best center we've had in 3 years. And I don't mean that as some backhanded compliment. It's easy to mock the Suns for picking him over Trae Young or Luka Doncic, but the man was seen as the consensus first overall pick for a reason. He has all the tools to be the quintessential modern center, with his ceiling being a perennial all-star. Tall, strong, able to guard the perimeter as easily as he can protect the paint. Really, his biggest concern is that aforementioned motor, which could just be him not wanting to be in Phoenix any longer, which, it's not exactly subtle. Like, he didn't just sign that offer sheet from the Pacers for comedic effect. His body language over there right now screams that he clearly doesn't want to be there. His outside shooting is on low volume, and he's not exactly shooting them in the high 30s, but his mid-range game has shown signs of the versatile do-it-all center he can be on offense, not to mention he's already one of the most effective big men in the league on offense. His career average in true shooting is nearly 63%, and he isn't going to be hacked to death in the playoffs like some other players I could mention. Granted, 75% from the line isn't amazing, but it's above what you'd expect for his position. That's my general thesis for DeAndre Ayton. As far as getting a starting caliber center among who's most likely to be available, Ayton is probably the best option out there for what you need to give up in order to get him. You do sacrifice a lot of financial flexibility for the next 3 years or so, though. With Ayton and Siakam alone, that's 2 contracts of about $30 million per year, and OG Anunoby will likely need to be extended as well. But DeAndre's contract will likely look much better with the anticipated cap spike, and he gives you hope for the future as well as a potential defensive foundation to rebuild from if you do decide to change the team's direction. Also, it's Masai and Bobby. They're putting protections on any draft capital they're sending out no matter what. Put another way, you don't need to worry about them giving up a future top 10 pick to a contender. The Miami Heat. It's Duncan Robinson and presumably draft capital, Nikola Jovic to take on that offer contract. Look, I really tried to envision a different Heat trade that makes sense, but there really isn't one that doesn't involve some framework of Duncan Robinson, draft capital, and or one of the younger players like Nikola Jovic. Much like Duncan himself, the options here are pretty limited. The Raptors aren't going to want to give up Gary Trent Jr. for Oladipo, a pick, and Dedmon. The Heat, likewise, aren't trading Hero for Gary Trent Jr. It has to be Robinson, and I doubt the Heat are going to want to give up the necessary package to actually get rid of him. Say what you will about Westbrook's contract, at least it's expiring this offseason. Duncan Robinson is on the hook for at least 3 more years, not counting this season. Robinson is a shooter. He recently broke the record for most threes made by a Heat player, but that's really all he brings. He's a pylon on defense, he isn't a self-creator, and like I said, that contract is just awful. Maybe a change of scenery will help him bounce back as a shooter, but again, he's still just a shooter, and there's a reason why I said he might bounce back, because he has fallen off hard as of late. Now, Jovic is actually one of the more interesting rookies from the 2022 draft. He's not super athletic or anything, but he's a rather uniquely skilled and versatile forward who has an impressive handle for a player tall enough to play the 5. It's just really hard to justify trading Trent Jr. for him when he comes with so egregious of a downgrade at the shooting guard in Duncan Robinson, when we're already lacking depth in our guard rotation, and whose contract is one of the few that could rival Bradley Beal's in terms of the negative value that it brings. This is another one of those maybe it'll work with the third team teams, but yeah, I can't see an obvious one-to-one with Miami. Now that we've gone over the main names mentioned, let's rapid fire some of the non-rumored teams that could be making calls for Gary Trent Jr. right now. The Oklahoma City Thunder. Whenever there's trade talks, you have to include the Thunder because they have some of the greatest flexibility in all of the NBA. Like, if they wanted to go all in and make a playoff run in this season, they have the perfect combination of young players and picks to make a deal out of for just about anyone that they could possibly want. 38 draft picks. And it's possible that by the time this video actually goes up, that Sam Presti has even more draft capital that he's accumulated through trades. The Thunder are practically drowning in draft capital, and that's kind of a problem. They have quite literally too many picks and do not have enough roster slots to actually be able to field them, so they do need to start cashing in on them and the young players that they've drafted in the near future. Like, they have 5 picks in this upcoming draft alone. They have to start consolidating their assets or try to kick that can down the road by trading for picks even further into the future, but I digress. I don't know if they consider Trent to be one of the pieces needed to get SGA to the finals, but he does fit the timeline with Shea and Lou, and they could definitely make a compelling offer for a Karis LeVert-like move. The only problem is matching salary. Most of the players on OKC are on rookie deals, and matching Gary Trent's money is a tricky affair with how small their salaries are in comparison, but they could easily facilitate the move as the third team with any one of the teams that I've mentioned. The Charlotte Hornets. Honestly, the main reason I'm bringing up the Hornets is because the Raptors have never made a trade with them, at least this incarnation of the team. I vaguely remember that they made one with the first one that became the Pelicans. There's also some news that broke earlier today that the Raptors were looking at Kelly Oubre before he got injured, which is just going after another forward who can't shoot threes. You guys just can't help yourselves, can you? Realistically, there's no player that makes sense for the Raptors to go after on Charlotte that would work under the salary rules who the Hornets should be willing to let go. The emphasis being should be, but this is the Hornets. They're one of the most inept organizations, not just in the NBA, but in all of North American sports. This is the organization that has a fetish for bad contracts and even worse trades. They gave up the pick that became Jalen Duren when they needed a new center for a bunch of seconds, a first from the Nuggets that's going to be way worse than the pick that they had in the 2022 draft, and then chose a center with their other first in the draft, only to give him around 4 minutes a game while starting Mason Plumlee. And it's not just Mark Williams who they're failing to develop. They have all these young players on their roster, and they refuse to field them for the sake of development. Now, these obviously aren't the only options out there, but they are the ones that I think are the most likely to happen. Gary Trent Jr. to the Pelicans is a popular one I've seen mentioned, but honestly, the Pelicans are in one of the best spots right now and don't need to make a move. They have tons of talent and plenty of draft assets. They don't need to make a move right now to win. They don't need to consolidate to contend. If healthy anyway. But what do you think? Was there a player package that you thought about that works for both teams? Is there a player that I failed to mention from any of the teams that we discussed here? Let me know in the comments and bell that subscribe button and all that general YouTuber and video stuff. Until next time.